promoted. Promotion Sunday. Doesn't quite work the same for the adults like it does for the kids. Anyway, glad to see everyone here. I think we've got a few more people on the way. So today is Promotion Sunday, but it's part of the Fall In campaign. What a clever name. All in, but in the fall, so it's Fall In. Following up, next week we'll have Generosity Sunday. Although really, the theme of next Sunday is to focus on, well, on that Sunday we'll focus on generosity, but then for starting today and going through September 9th, we're also asking that everyone give something to the church. It doesn't, any amount, it doesn't really matter, but the idea is to focus on participating financially. I'd also add this, it's probably a good time to maybe, well, I'll just tell you my own story. I used to, write a check, and then I switched over to giving online, but I did it through credit card payments. And then I figured out, oh wait, 2% of that I think is going to the credit card servicer. So then I switched over 3%. Thank you. Okay. So then so if I gave $100, only 97 was going to the church. So then I switched over to making it just directly out of my bank account. So maybe you could use this as an opportunity to kind of reevaluate how you give to help it fit with your schedule, your pattern. And then following up with that, September 2nd is a service Sunday, so we'll be focusing on different ways that you can participate by giving of yourself to different service activities. There will also be a survey that I think you'll get an email, so you can respond to that. It will ask different questions about how you would like to participate. And then finally on September 9th, we're going to do one massive, all-inclusive church photo after the 11 o'clock service. And that I will go in the church directory along with all of our other individual photos that we're now currently taking. And also as a reminder, there still are places available in September. If you haven't had your picture taken yet for the church directory, please do so. That will make Jared and Ryan's job so much easier since they are trying to learn everyone's name and face. Later this week, our Wednesday activities are starting up again. So we will have the noon and 5 o'clock dinner in the community hall. And also our usual array of, I say usual array of classes, a different array of classes. George and Mark are going to be leading a study of the parables. That will be for 3 Wednesday nights, it looks like. Also, Heather Mustaine is reprising her anagram class. And this is a new one I just now realized about. It looks like Erin Coyle-Carr, one of our senior pastoral residents, will be doing a class later in September and early October on the history of Christianity as it developed within the Roman Empire. So sort of a theology history lesson, 2 Wednesdays by Erin Coyle-Carr. That's coming up. What time is that? That is, I guess it would be 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock. The first one is September 26th, and then followed the next Wednesday, October 3rd. The other classes I mentioned are starting this upcoming Wednesday.
No, it's Wednesday after. This Wednesday is Vespers.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm right. I'm wrong. Thank you. All right. So Vespers this Wednesday, and then the classes resume the Wednesday after. Thank you. I rushed through all that very quickly.
I'm all about dinners, so I read that part.
Yeah. Anything I should add? Anything that I've left out? Anybody? Any announcements?
There may still be a chance to do room at the inn, because the last one is going to be this week.
This coming up Saturday. and, is that right?
Yeah,
Or Friday
Friday,
and
Saturday.
Saturday.
Friday and Saturday.
So in the email that I sent, and I don't do it as well as Dennis does as far as getting the link there, but I think I got the links to both.
Yes, it works,
this-
because I tried it.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's the Sign Up Genius link, or you can link to the church website that then takes you to the Sign Up Genius link. And you can sign up for Room at the End, which will be this Friday and Saturday.
And Mark is also
Yes.
hosting a 13-day trip to Ireland next spring.
Do you have a date on that? There was no date given on our.
There was not. There's September something is going to be the presentation on the trip, and then I'll probably tell you the dates then.
And it's not a Wilshire Adventures thing. I mean, he made that clear, but it's not, anybody can go on, that can afford it, can go on this trip. So, yeah.
Do I need to be birthday police today? I don't think so. Doesn't look like it. Okay. All right, so I will circulate the prayer book, prayer request book. If you have a prayer request you'd like to share, please add it. We'll do it at the end of class. But in the meantime, I was about to say I'll introduce Jared Jaggers, but how long have you been a member of Wilshire?
About 4.5 years.
Yeah, so Jared is already very familiar with the community. He's been a part of us for almost 5 years, but is now starting on as a first-year resident, graduate of Bright Divinity School.
That's right.
Where'd you go to college? I forgot.
I went to East Texas Baptist University over in Marshall.
So one of the things that Jared did as a relatively new member, he and I both served on the study group when we had the
And Diana.
and Diana. So meet Diana, Jared. Anybody else in the room? I don't think so. Served on the study group when we studied the issue of same-gender relationships. And the thing I most remember about Jared was he was very active in the discussion. He also put together one of the presentations. We had a series of sessions where we just gave these presentations to the congregation about trying to capture the different viewpoints and issues. And so Jared put together one and presented it at most of the sessions, but you had to be absent a couple of times. And I filled in for him. But I basically just read what he wrote. So I basically think of Jared as being that guy that made me look really smart a couple times in front of the church. So I'm always very grateful for that. Anyway, but he will be speaking on his own behalf now as he leads our class today on Ezekiel and Daniel. Welcome.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate y'all having me with you this morning. This morning we're going to talk about something that all of you, I think, already know in a variety of ways, but that is that context matters. And so as we talk about Ezekiel and Daniel this morning, I'm going to specify some ways that I think context really matters for these two books, but acknowledging that context matters, I'm going to take a few minutes and tell you a little bit about myself, because my context also matters for how I'm approaching these things, and hopefully I'll answer some of the questions that you may have about me. So as Henry said, I've been around for a few years now. I was actually born in Fort Worth and grew up mostly in the Denver area. So I've moved around a little bit. People ask me where I'm from, and I say, I don't really know, but I guess Dallas now. So my wife and I got married in 2013 and moved to Dallas immediately after we got married for her job. We've been here since then, and I initially worked in the insurance industry, but Wilshire really has been integral in my whole journey to be here as a resident now. It was Wilshire and George that helped me discern that I wanted to pursue church-related ministry. So I moved back to Texas from Colorado when I was in high school, and I decided I wanted to study the Bible, but I was pretty focused on becoming a professor. And so I went to East Texas Baptist University, which is almost to Louisiana, on I-20 if you don't know. And I spent several years there and was planning to become a professor, but when I got out, I don't know if you know this, but religion, the study of religion in the academia is not exactly a booming job market. And so I diverted routes a little bit and worked in the insurance industry. Quickly became dissatisfied. I don't know if you know this about humans, but people generally don't want someone else telling them what to do about their health or their money. And I had the joy of being able to do both. So people had a lot of kind words for me when I called them and told them what doctors they had to see and how their paycheck would be affected and all that stuff. I handled work injury claims as an insurance adjuster. So after a couple of years and deciding I didn't want to do that, Wilshire helped me discern that sort of the path I was on was really guiding me toward doing the work of the church. So I went to seminary for a few years at Bright Divinity School at TCU in Fort Worth. And it really kind of became, well, I like to say that I kind of fell in love with the role of a pastor. I got really excited about preaching and the other things that pastors do that are a little bit less visible, and got really excited about doing that. And so I'm very, very glad to be, or to remain here with you and keep growing and keep learning these things. So thanks for having me this morning. Haven't got to spend a lot of time up here on the 3rd floor in these 4 years at Wilshire, so I'm glad to be here with you. Thanks for having me. I know that you guys have studied a lot of the Old Testament by now. I think, if I'm not mistaken, you're pretty near the end of your journey through the Old Testament. So let's have a bit of a pop quiz. Does anybody know, I know you talked a little bit about some of the history around the prophets and the exile. Does anybody know where Ezekiel and Daniel fall in that sort of history? Whether you remember or not, I'm going to brush up our memory. So, but if you know the answer, I'm going to give you the opportunity for some kudos. So, it's important to know these things when we're talking about some of these books like Ezekiel and Daniel. So as you all know, when Israel developed a monarchy under David and then Solomon, the monarchy eventually split. And so we all know that there was Israel in the north, and that there was Judah. This is not very good. Thank you. Israel in the north, and Judah was the southern kingdom. So you're going to hear exile talked about when you hear biblical history and things like that. So there's kind of two different things that happen. So in the year 701, and we're talking BC or BCE, the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom. And it, for the most part, ceased to exist at that point. And then by 612, the Assyrians who conquered Israel have now been conquered by the Babylonians. So the Babylonians, when we get to Ezekiel, are sort of the Mesopotamian superpower. They're the folks that are running the show in the whole region that we might know as the ancient Near East, including, Turkey, Macedonia, Greece, all the way down to Egypt in North Africa. So Babylon is running the show at this point. And in the year 597, this is kind of a key date. If you're into the dates, I want you to kind of be able to see the chronology here. In 597, Babylon comes to Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, and they lay siege to it. And they don't conquer Jerusalem in 597, but they do carry off into exile some of the elites of Judah. So some of the sort of royalty of Judah, some of the educated people, and some of the upper crust of Judean society get taken to Babylon. And that is where we find ourselves in the book of Ezekiel. Maybe the most important date of the entire Old Testament is 586. And this is the date that the Babylonians come back to Jerusalem and actually conquer Jerusalem at that point. They sack the city and carry off more people to Babylon and only leave a remnant of people, is a term often used. They leave a remnant of people back in Judah. But in this time period, a lot of the Judean people are taken to Babylon. So our Bible, often the stories we read take place in this context. A lot of the Psalms we read that lament and look for God's faithfulness take place in this context. And our Bible was actually compiled and put together as the sacred texts of the Hebrew people after this time. So this is kind of a key date in the Old Testament. So, kind of a big picture of a few hundred years of history, but the important thing to note is that in 597, when this first group of people are taken to Babylon, Ezekiel was one of those people. So let's read a little bit of the opening of Ezekiel and try to understand a little bit about what he is talking to us about. If we can, I would like us to maybe have a few volunteers to read who maybe we can split up these first couple chapters, but it's really vivid language, and I'd like us to kind of hear it aloud before we talk about his book. It's kind of a lot, but if we can have a few people split it up, who would be willing to read for us?
For those of you like me that couldn't remember where Ezekiel was in the Bible, 672.
Right, perfect.
672.
672.
I'll do the first one, which,
Okay, we'll have Henry start, maybe read, would you read 1 through 14
of chapter 1.
of chapter 1?
Okay.
And then, Vicki, would you read 15 through 25? And then let's maybe have 2 more people if you're willing.
We'll do some.
Kelly, would you read 26 through the end of chapter 1?
Okay.
And then if somebody would read all of chapter 2, Diana, it's brief. So Henry, kick us off.
In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the river Chebar, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King
Jehoiachin.
Jehoiachin, thank you. The word of the Lord came to the priest Ezekiel, son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Chebar, and the hand of the Lord was on him there. As I looked, a stormy wind came out of the north, a great a cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually in the middle of the fire, something like gleaming amber. In the middle of it was something like 4 living creatures. This was their appearance. They were of human form. Each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had human hands, and 4 had their faces and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another. Each of them moved straight ahead, without turning as they moved. As for the appearance of their faces, the 4 had the face of a human being, the face of a lion on the right side, the face of an ox on the left side, and the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out above. Each creature had 2 wings, each of which touched the wing of another, while 2 covered their bodies. Each moved straight ahead, wherever the Spirit would go when they went, without turning as they went. In the middle of the living creatures, there was something that looked like burning coals of fire, like torches moving to and fro among the living creatures. The fire was bright, and lightning issued from the fire. The living creatures darted to and fro like a flash of lightning.
As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the 4 of them. As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl, and the 4 had the same form, their construction being something like a wheel within a wheel. When they moved in any of the 4 directions without veering as they moved. Their rims were tall and handsome, for the rims of all 4 were full of eyes all round. When the living creatures moved, the wheels moved beside them, and when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went, and the wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When they moved, the others moved. When they stopped, the others stopped. And when they rose from the earth, the wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Over the heads of living creatures there was something like a dome, shining like crystal, spread out above their heads. Under the dome, their wings were stretched out straight, one toward another, and each of the creatures had 2 wings covering its body. When they moved, I heard the sound of their wings like the sound of mighty waters, like the thunder of the Almighty, a sound of tumult, like the sound of an army. When they stopped, they let down their wings. And there came a voice from above the dome over their heads. When they stopped, they let down their wings.
Above the expanse over their heads was what looked like a throne of sapphire, and high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire, and that from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking.
He said to me, O mortal, stand up on your feet, and I will speak with you. And when he spoke to me, a spirit entered into me and set me on my feet, and I heard him speaking to me. He said, Mortal, I am sending you to the people of Israel, to a nation of rebels who have rebelled against me. They and their ancestors have transgressed against me to this very day. The descendants are impudent and stubborn. I am sending you to them, and you shall say to them, Thus says the Lord God, whether they hear or refuse to hear, for they are a rebellious house, they shall know that there has been a prophet among them. And you, O mortal, do not be afraid of them, and do not be afraid of their words, though briars and thorns surround you, and you live among scorpions. Do not be afraid of their words, and do not be dismayed at their looks, for they are a rebellious house. You shall speak my words to them, whether they hear or refuse to hear, for they are a rebellious house. But you, mortal, hear what I say to you. Do not be rebellious like that rebellious house. Open your mouth and eat what I give you. I looked, and a hand was stretched out to me, and a written scroll was in it. He spread it before me. It had writing on the front and on the back, and written on it were words of lamentation and mourning and woe.
I'm sorry, I just realized we need the first few verses of chapter 3. He said to me, O mortal, eat what is offered to you. Eat this scroll, and go speak to the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he gave me the scroll to eat. He said to me, Mortal, eat this scroll that I give you, and fill your stomach with it. And I ate it, and in my mouth it was as sweet as honey. So let me ask you this first. This is a very vivid description here. How do you, what do you think this is as far as the genre of literature? How does this come across to you as you hear it?
Apocryphal.
I'm sorry?
Apocryphal. I should-
Apocryphal?
Yeah.
What is that?
Apocryphal.
I don't know the word.
Yeah, like,
End times, right?
yeah, so, did you mean apocryphal, like, sort of outside what's accepted, or?
I'm thinking more like Revelation
Like
type.
apocalyptic.
Apocalyptic, thank you,
Yeah,
yes.
apocalyptic, so having to do with the end times, yeah.
I think actually this, we ended up making that error before.
Yes.
And I remember talking about the difference between apocryphal and apocalyptic. But anyway, I don't want to.
It was up on the board, we did talk about it.
Yeah,
okay.
And none of us remember.
Forgot.
Yeah, so, yes, there is a difference, and apocryphal are specifically related to the Bible. Apocryphal books are books that are not included in sort of the traditionally accepted Christian Bible or the Hebrew Bible. So some of you may have Bibles with this group of books between the Old Testament and New Testament. Those are the apocryphal books. So Greek Orthodox, Roman Orthodox accept them as part of their Bible. And for a lot of Christians, they're like almost sacred, but not quite.
Not enough to make it in.
So, yeah, not enough to make the cut as sort of that top tier of Scripture. Whereas, apocalyptic is a word, it's a Greek word that means to uncover or to reveal. And so we often use this in reference to the end of all things. So an apocalypse literally would be when everything is uncovered or when things are revealed. So the last book of the Bible that we call Revelation, the title in Greek is the Apocalypse of John. And so we call it the Revelation according to John, or the Revelation of John, or something like that. So that type of literature we're actually going to talk about in just a couple of minutes. But yes, it's a very specific genre that kind of relates to the future and the end of all things.
It's also prophetic, right?
Yeah.
Because he's telling them to go preach.
Yep, yes. And you've talked about Isaiah and some of these other books where the prophet has the story of his call to be a prophet in the book. That's what this is. This is the call of the prophet Ezekiel, which interestingly Ezekiel's not included with the prophets in the Jewish version of the Old Testament, but that might be outside what we're concerned with today. But he presents himself as a prophet here in this call story. What else do you notice though about these creatures, and what sort of story does this seem like, maybe outside of biblical things, but what sort of story does it feel like? Yep, a mythological story,
Very good.
science fiction, fairy
Yeah.
tale,
Yeah, fantasy. I keep on thinking about
That's what I was thinking
fantasy.
of.
fantasy.
You know.
That's what I meant.
Yep.
Fantasy.
Yeah, I think these are all apt descriptions of kind of what we're dealing with here. Let me ask you this question. How do you imagine the person that wrote this? What do you think that person is like? Ezekiel, who has this vision, God gives him a scroll to eat, and he's seen this vision of these creatures. How do you imagine that person?
Using drugs.
I was thinking, just didn't want to say it.
Good. Maybe a little crazy.
I picture him with John, you know, like we're garments eating locusts and honey.
Yeah.
Live in the wilderness.
Yeah, hallucination maybe. So this is a really interesting topic that people have debated about for a long time. So here's some things we know about Ezekiel. First of all, interestingly enough, unlike many biblical books, there's no reason to think that Ezekiel did not write the book that has his name on it. So Ezekiel seems to have been a priest that worked in the temple in Jerusalem and was just shy of being ordained, for lack of a better term, as a full priest in the temple in Jerusalem when he was taken to Babylon. And so as an educated man who was studying to be one of the priests in the temple, he was taken because he could read and he could do all of these things. And he has a sort of conflict on his hands because Jerusalem is the city of God, and the temple is sort of the sacred center of the city of God. This is where God lives. This is where God is present with the people of Israel, and he is a priest of that God. But now, he and all of these other people have been taken outside of the promised land. And so he finds himself in this opening story to be the first prophet called by God outside of the promised land. So he has sort of a dilemma on his hands theologically, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But Ezekiel is this priest who's been carried off. He writes almost the whole book after those first 4 verses that kind of introduce him, that Henry read for us. He writes almost the whole thing as a first-person autobiography. He says, I saw the vision.
It was so specific. He did everything to tell you the time of day on that first verse.
That's right. That's right. Very specific. And as you've seen, there's some oddness to how he writes. It's very fantastical. It's very vivid and very science fiction-like, as you've all said. And so people have often speculated about who is this guy. And a few of the theories are exactly what you have observed. Some people have said, well, he shows the signs of being epileptic. And so that's what's going on here. Some people have read it and said, well, no, he's actually more like a catatonic, like a person who suffers from catatonic schizophrenia. And so he has these catatonic states where he sees visions and hears voices and all of these things. And so that's actually what was going on. Other people have said drug use. And that no, he actually was just sort of a mystic who probably dabbled in some mind-altering drugs, and this was the result. And other people have even said, well, actually, he was abducted by aliens. And this opening vision of these creatures and the wheels that move in any direction and all this, it's a UFO, naturally.
Yes, yes.
But I think what's important to note is whether any of those things are true or not, Ezekiel is definitely a spiritual mystic. And Ezekiel is definitely a person who values this creative writing and this vivid imagery. And if you continue to read, you could almost say that Ezekiel is also a performance artist. Ezekiel does these bizarre things as part of his prophecies. One of them is that he cuts off his hair and he scatters some of it to the wind and he burns some of it. And it's a way of saying the people of Israel, some are going to be scattered to the wind, to Babylon, and to all these other places. Some are going to die and be burned like my hair. He lays on his side for a year and cooks his food over feces. And he is doing these sorts of performance art to show the people that this is what this is going to be like. It's going to get even worse. And he's doing these things, according to the story, in this gap right here. He has already been taken to Babylon, and he's saying things are going to get worse because Jerusalem will be conquered. The people will be scattered, and things are going to get even worse than we could imagine. So he's sort of a performance artist. He's definitely a creative writer, and some people have described him as a surrealist, and I think that fits pretty well. But sort of tackling what we've just read, I want to kind of distill this down for you and give you some hints at the important points to come in his book. So he describes these creatures that are on top of or beside a wheel, and there's a dome with a throne on top. And so if you imagine almost like a chariot, that these creatures and these sort of magical wheels that move in any direction and have eyes in them, on top of this is one that looks like a man, but is, he says, this was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God. So, as a good Jewish priest, he's not going to say that he saw God, because no one can see God and live in his tradition. So he says this is the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. So he's almost like removing himself 3 steps, but saying this chariot with a throne on top and these fantastical creatures is carrying the glory of God. And what is happening here in his call story is that the glory of God on this sort of heavenly chariot is actually leaving Jerusalem. And he sees a vision of God going with the people to Babylon. And then God gives him this scroll and a prophecy to give the people, but instead of a scroll that could be burned or could be stolen by the Babylonians or something of that sort, he eats this scroll. And this is now a word from God that has been internalized. And so I think that these images are things that Ezekiel is going to carry forward in the rest of his prophecy. He's going to go on, and he's going to talk about God being present with the exiles in Babylon. He's going to do the things that prophets normally do. He's going to write chapters of woe to Israel for their sins. And he's going to write chapters of woe to Israel's enemies, that God is going to do things right. And he has this idea through all of that God is going to remain with the people even outside the promised land. And he even seems to think that because God has gone with the people to Babylon, that it's actually the people who were unfaithful that were left behind in Jerusalem. And so he's going to call them to revitalize their worship of God and these sorts of things. So he kind of does these typical prophet-like things in saying these words of woe to different nations, calling people to stop sinning and worship God faithfully. But he ends up as an optimist toward the end of the book, and he has these chapters, chapters 40 through 48 of his book, that are apocalyptic literature that we've already talked about just a little bit. And so he concludes his book with a vision of a new Jerusalem. And he's already talked about the destruction of Jerusalem that he seems to have heard about from Babylon. Kind of as a side note, Jeremiah and Ezekiel were living at the same time. Jeremiah was in Judah, in Jerusalem, and Ezekiel was in Babylon.
We studied Jeremiah last week.
Oh, okay.
With Tony Martin. Yeah.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice. So these prophecies are happening at the same time. And because Ezekiel writes about the destruction of Jerusalem, people kind of assume, well, some correspondence was being sent between the two places. So it's even possible that Ezekiel and Jeremiah may have been aware of each other's prophetic writings.
Jared, one thing that I didn't realize that we learned a few weeks ago is that this was the birth of the synagogues. You know, before they thought they could only worship God in Jerusalem.
Yes.
But now, since they were dispersed, they started coming up with synagogues, which are still in existence today, of course.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, which I didn't realize that was the start of it.
Yep. And so Ezekiel's theology that God has gone with the people, and the history of Judaism, that, you know, Jews are still scattered all over the world. And there still is the diaspora, the disbursement of Jews. Ezekiel's a pretty key theology for that, because he has this vision of God going with the people. So he has this whole story, and he concludes with this vision of a new Jerusalem and the temple being restored. And so his kind of overall message is one that this exile isn't forever, and that God will be faithful. Even if it's at the end, even if we don't know when it will be. And he can only talk about it in this apocalyptic, vivid imagery, fantastical way. That he still has this strong hope that God will be faithful and that exile will not be forever. Let me tell you a little bit more about apocalyptic literature, and we're going to really quickly talk about the book of Daniel, and then I want to have a little bit of time for questions. But so he concludes with apocalyptic literature, and we're going to see in a moment that Daniel also concludes with apocalyptic literature. So there's some key themes that you're going to recognize from stories you've heard in the book of Revelation and things like that. But there's some key things that apocalyptic literature always has. There's always a human, usually the writer, that has some sort of vision or heavenly messenger from God. So John sees the angel of the churches and receives this whole vision in the book of Revelation. You've already seen Ezekiel does this, and then Daniel has visions. And apocalyptic literature always uses fantastical imagery and almost like coded language. And part of that is that they use some mythology and some mythic traditions. So there's often a story of God in battle and defeating the evildoers and those sorts of things. And it's always dualistic. There's always a good and bad, light and dark, present and future kind of competing dualism in apocalyptic literature. And so this is a kind of literature that developed slowly. There's some hints at it in the Old Testament, but it wasn't really a full-blown genre that people wrote in until much later in history. And it often came from a moment of crisis, like the exile, because this is a time when people's hope was as scattered as the people were. And they had to look somewhere for hope and for understanding what God was up to. And so that was a time in which people turned to this imaginative hope that looked into the future and tried to imagine what God was up to. And so their theology that God would be faithful, that exile wouldn't be forever, like Ezekiel says, takes on this form of almost like The Lord of the Rings or whatever your favorite fantasy might be, that I believe this so strongly that I'm going to write this story to give us hope. And it's what all good novels do, right? And it's what a lot of good literature and good films that we love, this is what they do. So, Daniel deserves more than 5 minutes, but we're going to do it. We're going to do it. Daniel is a really interesting book because, unlike Ezekiel, Daniel was almost certainly not written by Daniel. And Daniel was probably actually written, this is the 6th century BC. Daniel was probably not written until the 2nd century BC. Several hundred years later, although Daniel is pictured as being in Babylon, and in the story of Daniel, he's carried off with Ezekiel. But the story is almost certainly told after the fact because of some of the details hinted at in Daniel. But the idea that scholars have come up with that best explains it is that in the 2nd century, this is when the Hellenistic Empire, the Greeks, were taking over Judah. And the Maccabean revolt was happening, in which a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes sacrificed a pig on the altar in the Temple of Jerusalem. As you know, pigs are unclean, and this made the temple itself ritually unclean. So this is often called the abomination of desecration. You don't get much more powerful names for events than that. It's an abomination, and it desecrates the temple. So in the book of Daniel, there's actually a scene in which that is talked about. And in Daniel, it's foretold, but scholars say that there's so much detail to it that it almost certainly had to have been written after it happened. So that's what most scholars would tell you today, is that this was actually written after the fact, looking back. So Daniel's 12 chapters long, and it's very nicely and conveniently split in half for us. The first 6 chapters of Daniel are like a hero story. Think of the Iliad or the Odyssey. And Daniel is depicted as this hero of faithfulness. And so you have probably heard some of these stories. Daniel and his friends won't eat the king's food, so they ask for different food that's ritually clean for Judaism, and they're blessed and highly favored for it because they end up doing better than all of their cohort. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are asked to worship an idol, but they remain faithful, thrown into the fiery furnace and saved from the fire. Daniel is told that he can't pray to his God, but he remains faithful and is thrown in the lion's den, but is saved by an angel. So these stories are things that we all know and are pretty dear to our faith. And these are all stories of Daniel as a hero because he's not in the promised land. He is under the rule of a foreign empire, but he remains faithful to God. And so you can see why these stories would be very important to people living in Judah as the Greeks are coming in, desecrating the temple, because Daniel, they can look back at Daniel as an example of faithfulness in the face of even violence and even these horrible oppressive regimes. Interestingly enough, I think this is a fascinating thing to look at. One biblical scholar says that Joseph and his coat of many colors, you know, the story that he went to Egypt, rose to prominence. He was only second to the Pharaoh in Egypt, but he ended up ruling over Egypt and hoarding everybody's food, and to the point that he pretty much became an Egyptian ruler. And this biblical scholar says that Joseph is actually an example of what not to do. If this empire is ruling over you, don't act like the empire, but instead be like Daniel, who is there living under the empire, but remains faithful and stays true to his identity as a Jew and a God worshiper, despite what the empire does. Interesting thing to kind of meditate on, I think, as you hear these stories of Daniel's faithfulness. But then the second half of Daniel is very different and becomes one of these apocalyptic stories. So I'll just summarize it very quickly to say that there's stories of beasts and stories of beasts with horns that represent different kings and empires, and a lot of people interpret these in very different ways. So some people say that this is in reference to those events I just talked about with Antiochus and sacrificing the pig on the altar and all that sort of thing. Some people say, well, no, it actually fits Rome a little bit better. And some people say, actually, Daniel was foretelling the future and was talking about literally the end of the world. And so he literally was seeing these things in the future. He calls them visions, and he describes them the best he can, but they actually were visions of the future that he was seeing. So when he describes beasts with horns, some people say that those are actually tanks, and the horn is the cannon that sticks out the front of the tank. And some people want to understand it in a literal way. So all that to say that Daniel is really kind of the kicking off point of what we see in Christianity around us a lot as people try to sort of decipher the end times and sort of try to predict what's going to happen. All that comes from Daniel. And then later, the book of Revelation that was written later is also interpreted in sort of that same way. I will leave it to you to decide what you interpret about the nature of the Bible and whether he was talking and seeing about the future, or whether he was writing a book of hope to the people around him in his own context. But like Ezekiel, Daniel has this message that empires are going to become violent beasts, but God is going to fight these violent beasts and will win. And he tells it in this same fantastic imagery. And like Daniel, take hope and be faithful. So those are kind of the messages that Ezekiel and Daniel both share, and both share with us in these timeless ways, so that their imagery, instead of making it some weird thing of the ancient world, actually makes it kind of timeless, to where we can go into their stories and say, we can take hope, because just like they wrote these fantastic stories of God's faithfulness, we can take hope that God will be faithful in whatever's happening in our world. And so I think, despite all of the confusing imagery and the ways that people try to decode every little aspect of these stories, those messages are things that make Ezekiel and Daniel really beautiful books for us in 2018, as well as people in the 2nd century, as well as people in the 6th century before Christ. I just talked a lot. Maybe we can have a couple of minutes for questions, and then I'll hand it over to Henry for prayer.
I really like what you just said about the empire will become violent beasts. Because that, I mean, that's not just a lesson for back then, I think it's a lesson for today. If you look at the violence that's between nations, it's not the regular people of one country who don't like the other people of another country. That violence comes from the governments. I spent time in the Soviet Union and Marine, I proposed to Marine in Cuba. We went around and talked to people, so we got all over the world. And that's what we always see. Remember in Cuba, people said, you know, we love the American people, we hate the American government. And the same thing is true of, you know, Russia versus America, America versus China. You know, it's the governments, they become violent beasts.
And can you say the governments
Yeah.
are leaders? Can you say,
Yeah.
are the governments are
They're
leaders?
not gonna lead me. And that's why I spent time, I spend my career is all about trying to help people understand this.
Yeah.
this
I think that's well said, and I think that the imagery of these books describes them as beasts. I think it's really powerful, just like you said, and it's bigger than any one person. It's a beast, or a system, or a government, or a regime, however you want to describe it, it's bigger than any one person, and it crushes people under
Yeah.
it.
When you use the word timeless, it's bigger than any one person or regime, but also bigger than any one particular one at any one particular time. That's what makes apocalyptic literature so powerful, is that the timeless nature of it. And I would argue that you do it a disservice, people do it a disservice when they try to say that apocalyptic literature is only describing one particular time in history. It's only, Daniel was only talking about tanks. Well, you can look at tanks in modern warfare and go back and read Daniel and say, hey, he was onto something there. But he was also speaking to people, as you said, in the 6th century, in the 2nd century, in the before and after. And so for people to take Daniel or Revelation or whatever and to say, this is specifically what it means, to me, that seems kind of selfish. God's only talking to me in the 21st century about what I'm going through in the country I live in.
Yep.
No, God's talking to all of us at all times through apocalyptic literature.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And this is part of my story that you can ask me about later, but my dad has said to me before, doesn't it take away the power of Scripture if Daniel wasn't actually foretelling the future? Can we trust his words? But I think, like Henry, friends, doesn't that make our gospel and our faith so much more powerful that, no, Daniel is talking about the real world, and that this reality that governments and systems are always becoming beasts. And God is winning again and again, and God will win, and that's our hope. That's our theology. Isn't that so much more powerful than we have a magical book that tells us about the end of time? I think it's a much more powerful thing than that.
We have a scriptural, spiritual book that tells us about the nature of time.
Yeah.
And what's going on, what has been going on, and what is still going on.
Yeah. I think that's
Can I tell you a little bit thing? When I was in the Soviet Union, I met a guy who was a spy. He was a friend of mine. The kid was a spy for America. I mean, for Soviet Union, trying to counter spy for America. Anyway, so he took me from his apartment. He's one day over to a graveyard in Kiev. And as you enter the graveyard, it's about the first stones you see. The first are about 1880. Yeah, just regular crosses, gravestones. The further you get into the graveyard, the closer, the further you get up in time, it changes from crosses to statues of people. The Soviet leaders become immortalized in the graveyard. They become heroes. They become, and so you know, it changes. The government changed people away from God to themselves, the leaders, as being almost like deity.
interesting. Interesting. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley.
And come back, please.
Please.
I'd love to.
Please.
Sounds wonderful to me.
You're messing today.